The familiar scent of turpentine and old pine always made 31-year-old Clara feel like her grandfather was still standing right beside her easel, guiding her brush. The loft was bathed in the fading, bruised purple light of a late November afternoon in Boston. Snow had just begun to fall, tiny white flakes catching the glow of the street lamps outside the massive industrial windows. Clara wiped a smudge of cerulean blue from her forehead with the back of her oversized, paint-speckled sweater. This studio, with its exposed brick and creaky hardwood floors, was her sanctuary. It was a space inherited not just in deed, but in spirit, from a man who had taught her that art was the truest form of listening. Walking over to the antique oak desk tucked in the corner, she gently opened the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath a stack of old sketchbooks, lay a thick, folded property deed. A faded coffee stain bloomed across its corner, a quiet testament to her grandfather's meticulous, if slightly messy, planning before he passed away. She didn't look at it often, but knowing it was there, knowing he had fiercely protected this space for her, anchored her to the world. She spent another hour cleaning her brushes, the rhythmic motion soothing her nerves. The historic neighborhood around her was rapidly gentrifying, the quiet cobblestone streets now buzzing with high-end boutiques and luxury condos. Yet, her building remained a stubborn relic of history. She finally bundled up, pulling a heavy woolen scarf around her neck, and locked the heavy metal door behind her. It was time for the pre-Thanksgiving dinner with her family, an obligation that usually required more emotional armor than her winter coat provided. The wind off the harbor was biting as she walked the 3 blocks to the Maple Diner. The old-school establishment was an institution in the neighborhood, its buzzing neon sign a beacon against the gray Boston winter. Inside, the air was thick, carrying the deeply comforting aromas of dark drip coffee, roasting turkey, and warm cinnamon apples. The diner was crowded, a symphony of clinking heavy ceramic mugs and the low hum of small talk. She spotted them immediately in a corner booth. Julian, her 34-year-old brother, looked entirely out of place in his sharp, expensive tailored suit, his thumbs flying across the screen of his smartphone. Across from him sat Richard and Martha, their parents, who beamed at him with the kind of unbridled pride they usually reserved for country club newsletters. "Clara, finally," Martha said, offering a tight, perfunctory smile as Clara slid into the vinyl booth. "You have paint in your hair again." Clara ignored the remark, ordering a simple black coffee. The conversation was immediately dominated by Julian's upcoming tech startup pitch. He spoke in rapid-fire corporate jargon, scalable metrics, seed rounds, angel investors. Richard nodded along sagely, while Martha patted Julian's arm. "And how is the painting going, sweetie?" Richard asked eventually, his tone suggesting he was asking a child about a finger-painting project. "I'm actually starting a new series," Clara began, a spark of genuine excitement in her voice. "It's focusing on urban memory, the way these old buildings." "It's a cute phase, Clara," Julian interrupted, not even looking up from his phone. "But you really need a real, scalable plan. You can't just hide in Grandpa's dusty old room forever. You need to leverage your assets." The dismissal stung, familiar and sharp. To them, her life was a hobby, an invisible, non-revenue-generating disappointment. Before she could form a reply, the heavy glass door of the diner jingled open, letting in a blast of freezing wind. An older woman stepped inside, shivering violently. She wore a worn, oversized wool coat that had seen better decades, and a faded scarf wrapped tightly around her head. She looked exhausted, her face pale against the bitter Boston cold. She didn't take a booth. Instead, she stood near the counter, quietly asking the overworked waitress if she might just have a cup of hot water to warm her hands. Julian glanced over, rolling his eyes in exaggerated disgust. "Unbelievable," he groaned loudly, his voice carrying over the diner's ambient noise. "This is exactly why property values in this neighborhood are going to stall. They let these vagrants just wander in. She should go to a shelter, not a restaurant." Martha shushed him, but only half-heartedly. clearly agreeing. Clara looked at her brother, a wave of profound sadness washing over her. She didn't argue. She knew that words were useless against that kind of entrenched arrogance. Instead, she waited until Julian returned to his emails and her parents resumed their fawning. Clara quietly slid out of the booth, pretending she needed the restroom. She walked over to the busy waitress near the counter. Opening her modest leather wallet, Clara pulled out a crisp $20 bill. "Excuse me," Clara whispered, her voice warm and steady. She pressed the bill into the waitress's apron pocket, along with an extra 10 for a generous cash tip. "Could you please bring that lady over there a large hot black coffee and a warm slice of your apple pie? And please, don't tell her it was from me. Just let her sit and get warm." The waitress looked at Clara, a soft, understanding smile breaking through her exhaustion. "You got it, honey." Clara returned to her family's table, her heart feeling incredibly light despite the heavy atmosphere. She watched from the corner of her eye as the waitress guided the older woman to a small table near the radiator, setting down a steaming mug and a generous slice of pie. The woman looked surprised, her hands trembling as she wrapped them around the warm ceramic. Clara didn't need a thank you. The quiet dignity restored to that small corner of the diner was more than enough. The dinner continued, filled with Julian's boasts and her parents' applause, but Clara felt anchored by the secret warmth of her simple gesture. As Clara walked back to her loft that night, breathing in the crisp winter air, she completely missed the ominous text message lighting up her phone from her mother. "We found a solution for Julian's funding. We'll talk tomorrow." Before we find out exactly what that ominous text message from Clara's mother truly means, I have a quick favor to ask. If you are still watching this video and finding value in Clara's quiet act of kindness today, please leave a comment with the number 8 down below, just to let me know you are still here listening with me. And if you haven't already, I highly encourage you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your wonderful support is what allows us to keep creating great content to inform, entertain, and inspire you here on Retribution Raw. Alright, now let's get right back to the story. Clara returned from a weekend art retreat in coastal Maine only to find her sanctuary wrapped in cold, steel scaffolding like a cage. The drive back to Boston had been peaceful, filled with quiet reflections on the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic waves and the fresh inspiration she had gathered for her new urban memory series. She had practically felt her grandfather's old wooden stool waiting for her, ready to support another long night of mixing oils and chasing the perfect shade of brick red. But as her cab turned the final corner onto her familiar street, that serene anticipation violently shattered. The cryptic, unsettling message she had received from her mother just days prior, a vague text hinting at a sudden financial solution for Julian's company, finally snapped into a horrifying, undeniable reality. A heavy, overcast Monday morning draped the historic neighborhood in a suffocating layer of gray. The usually charming cobblestone avenue was completely swallowed by the deafening, mechanical roar of heavy machinery. Dumpsters squatted aggressively on the curb like iron beasts, their rusted bellies overflowing with jagged chunks of pale drywall, twisted metal piping, and splintered wood. The biting, bitter winter wind whipped Clara's hair across her cheeks, but the freezing temperature was nothing compared to the icy dread flooding her veins. Dropping her canvas travel bags right onto the snowy sidewalk, Clara stared in absolute disbelief. Workers clad in neon safety vests and scuffed hard hats were hauling raw materials out of the building's beloved lobby, tossing debris without a second thought for the century-old architecture. Clara stumbled forward, her chest tightening with every step. She spotted a burly, neutral-faced construction foreman standing near a flatbed truck, casually sipping coffee from a paper cup while checking a rugged tablet. Clara rushed up to him, her voice cracking as she demanded to know what was happening to her home. The foreman sighed, accustomed to neighborhood complaints. With polite, corporate indifference, he turned the screen toward her. It was a digital work order bearing the slick logo of a prominent local property developer, clearly stating that the entire site was undergoing immediate, full demolition to make way for high-rise luxury condominiums. The building, he casually mentioned, had officially changed hands over the weekend. Panic seizing her throat, Clara fumbled with her phone. Her fingers were trembling so badly she nearly dropped the device into the slush before dialing her mother's number. Martha answered almost instantly, her tone impossibly bright, cheerful, and entirely disconnected from the physical destruction currently tearing apart Clara's life. "Mom, there are bulldozers outside the studio," Clara breathed out, her voice frantic. "They're tearing the lobby apart." Before Clara could even formulate another sentence, Martha clicked her tongue in deep irritation. "Oh, Clara, please don't overreact," her mother scolded, speaking to her like a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "We made a necessary family business decision. You were away, and time was of the essence. We couldn't let your emotional attachment get in the way of a crucial opportunity." There was a muffled rustle on the receiver, and then Julian's voice filled the line, dripping with relentless corporate arrogance. He didn't offer a shred of an apology. Instead, he launched into a sterile, rapid-fire explanation about his startup. He needed immediate liquid capital, he claimed, and a solid physical asset to show as collateral for his crucial seed funding round. He spoke as if Clara's life, her sacred art, and their grandfather's deeply cherished memory were just inconvenient numbers on a spreadsheet that he had the inherent right to erase. "Julian, you sold my studio without telling me," Clara whispered, the sheer audacity of the betrayal knocking the wind out of her lungs. "It's just a room, Clara. You can paint anywhere," Julian insisted, his voice sharp, dismissive, and utterly devoid of empathy. "I'm building something scalable. Something that actually matters in the real world. Stop being so selfish for once and look at the big picture. This is about our family's legacy." "Your legacy, you mean," Clara shot back, tears of frustration stinging the corners of her eyes. Martha's voice echoed loudly in the background, demanding that Clara finally step up, stop playing the victim, and support her brother's future. Then, a sharp, decisive click. They had hung up on her, leaving her standing entirely alone in the freezing, noisy, dust-choked street. Disorientated and furious, Clara pushed past the foreman, completely ignoring the warning shouts of the construction crew. She ran up the narrow, dusty staircase. The air inside the stairwell tasted thickly of chalk and ruin, erasing the faint, familiar scent of old pine and turpentine she loved so much. Reaching the third-floor landing, she gasped, pressing her hand against her mouth. Her hallway, once warmly lit and welcoming, was completely stripped bare. The vintage brass mailbox her grandfather had polished every single Sunday was violently ripped from the wall, leaving a harsh, ugly rectangular scar on the plaster. But the ultimate, most devastating violation wasn't the missing brass or the torn drywall. Taped haphazardly to the center of her heavy metal door was an official legal notice of property transfer and an immediate eviction mandate. Clara leaned in, her eyes tracing the harsh black ink of the legal jargon until she reached the bottom of the page. Authorizing the immediate sale of the premises was a signature. It was a carefully practiced imitation, the loops too tight, the slant too aggressive. It looked suspiciously like hers, but it fundamentally wasn't. They hadn't just sold her sanctuary behind her back while she was out of town. Her own parents had committed forgery to do it. Standing in the dust of her grandfather's legacy, the urge to cry vanished, entirely replaced by a quiet, burning anger she never knew she possessed. Forgery was the definitive line where Clara's lifelong habit of keeping the peace finally shattered into a million pieces. The memory of her grandfather's voice, teaching her to look at a blank canvas until it stops being a threat, gave her the courage to step into a world she knew absolutely nothing about. Clara had carefully retrieved the original, coffee-stained deed from her grandfather's heavy oak desk before securing his vintage furniture in a temporary storage unit on the edge of town. Her very first stop that frantic, freezing afternoon was a crowded, underfunded legal aid clinic. The tired clerk at the front desk had taken one long look at the dense, century-old property clauses and slowly shaken his head. He explained that historic Boston real estate laws were a complicated labyrinth of archaic zoning codes and grandfathered rights, far too complex for a standard walk-in clinic to handle. He scribbled a prestigious address on a yellow sticky note, pointing her toward a high-end real estate specialist downtown, warning her gently that it would be a highly expensive, uphill battle against a major corporate developer. The transition from the gritty, dust-choked construction site of her ruined sanctuary to the bustling, highly polished downtown Boston office of a prestigious real estate law firm was incredibly jarring. Outside the soaring floor-to-ceiling windows, city workers were already hanging festive holiday wreaths and stringing golden lights around the ornate street lamps, eagerly preparing the city for Thanksgiving. Inside, the atmosphere was a hushed, intimidating sanctuary of corporate power. The air smelled richly of expensive polished leather and the dark, comforting aroma of fresh espresso. Clara felt painfully out of place as she sat in the pristine waiting area, her thrifted, paint-speckled winter coat contrasting sharply with the sleek marble floors and the tailored designer suits of the passing legal associates. Still, she gripped her faded manila folder tightly, letting her grandfather's lessons ground her racing heart and quiet her deep insecurities. A polished assistant eventually led her into a massive, glass-walled conference room overlooking the bustling harbor. Clara sat at the very edge of a massive mahogany table, bracing herself to explain her complete lack of corporate funds to some ruthless, time-obsessed legal shark. The heavy wooden door clicked open. Clara stood up politely, and the breath completely left her lungs. Walking into the room was not a cold, faceless executive. It was the older woman from the Maple Diner. She was no longer shivering violently in a worn, oversized wool coat with a faded scarf. Instead, she was dressed in a tailored, impeccable navy power suit, radiating sharp authority and effortless confidence. As the senior partner's eyes met Clara's, the formidable legal armor instantly softened into a gaze of profound, radiating warmth. Evelyn recognized her immediately. Instead of initiating a sterile, billing-focused consultation, Evelyn immediately buzzed her assistant, ordering a tray of proper coffee and warm pastries. She sat down across from Clara, leaning forward with genuine respect, and quietly thanked the young artist for the slice of pie, the hot cup of coffee, and, most importantly, the quiet dignity she had offered a supposed stranger on that freezing, miserable night. Overwhelmed but deeply relieved by the unexpected twist of fate, Clara poured out the entire nightmare. She explained the sudden, violent demolition of her studio, her brother Julian's desperate tech startup, the cruel and dismissive phone call from her parents, and finally, the blatant forgery on the eviction mandate taped to her door. Evelyn listened in focused, absolute silence, her expression hardening into professional steel as she took the old, coffee-stained deed from Clara's trembling hands. For several long minutes, the only sound in the large room was the crisp turning of fragile, aged paper. Then, a slow, triumphant smile crossed the senior attorney's face, reaching all the way to her eyes. Evelyn tapped a manicured finger against a specific, heavily worded paragraph near the bottom of the document. She explained, with the precision of a seasoned expert, the rare and incredibly powerful concept of split ownership. Decades ago, anticipating the historic neighborhood's eventual gentrification, Clara's grandfather had executed a brilliant legal maneuver. The developer had legally purchased the external shell of the building from her parents, which was entirely valid. However, the interior airspace, the specific physical build-out of Unit 3C, belonged solely and irrevocably to Clara. Her parents had absolutely no legal authority to convey it to anyone, and forging her signature instantly elevated the messy familial transaction to a matter of serious criminal fraud. Evelyn pointed a manicured finger at the paperwork and said, "They sold a hollow box, Clara. But they didn't sell the air inside it. And without your explicit permission, they can't tear down a single wall." Evelyn closed the heavy legal folder with a sharp, satisfying snap, looked Clara directly in the eye, and asked, "So, my dear, are you ready to show your brother what a real eviction looks like?" What an incredible turn of events. It looks like Clara finally has the power to fight back, thanks to a little bit of kindness and a very smart lawyer. Before we head into the courtroom, if you are still watching this video and finding value in this story, please comment with the number 1 down below just to let me know you are still here with me. While you're there, I would absolutely love it if you could leave a meaningful comment or a warm wish for Clara as she stands up for herself. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I highly encourage you to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our videos. Your wonderful support is what helps us continue to create great content to inform, entertain, and inspire you here on Retribution Raw. Alright, now let's continue with the story and see what happens at the courthouse. The heavy oak doors of the downtown Boston courthouse felt less like a barrier and more like a gateway to Clara's reclaimed independence. The crisp, authoritative sound of a heavy manila folder closing sharply from the previous afternoon still rang clearly in her memory, serving as a powerful mental shield while she observed the familiar, imposing figures of her parents emerging from a sleek black town car onto the icy pavement. It was a brisk, unforgiving Tuesday morning. The contrast between the freezing, turbulent wind whipping through the historic city streets and the heated, almost suffocating tension inside the grand, wood-paneled mediation room was incredibly palpable. Clara sat at one side of a long, highly polished mahogany table, her hands folded quietly in her lap. She felt remarkably grounded, deeply anchored by the undeniable truth she now held. Beside her sat Evelyn, looking every inch the formidable legal titan in her immaculate tailoring, her posture projecting a calm, immovable strength that commanded the entire room. The heavy doors swung open again, and her family entered, bringing a wave of impatient, chaotic energy with them. Richard and Martha were dressed to impress in expensive cashmere and tailored wool, their expressions pinched with a mixture of indignation and profound annoyance. They clearly expected Clara to fold immediately, assuming this formal legal proceeding was merely a temporary, emotional tantrum. Julian trailed right behind them, his brow furrowed in deep stress as he aggressively tapped the screen of his smartphone. He didn't even bother to take his tailored overcoat off, treating the mediation like a minor, irritating inconvenience on his way to a much more important corporate conquest. Martha didn't even offer a basic greeting. She simply dropped her designer handbag onto an empty leather chair and glared across the polished wood. Clara, this entire dramatic display is entirely unnecessary and incredibly selfish, she scolded, her tone dripping with heavy disappointment. You are actively trying to ruin your brother's timeline over a dusty old room. Julian finally looked up from his glowing screen, letting out a loud, theatrical sigh. He leaned his palms heavily on the table, speaking to Clara with the slow, condescending cadence one might use to placate a confused child. Look, we don't have time for this nonsense today, he stated flatly. I am willing to authorize a payout of $15,000 right now from my operational budget. Take the money, go rent a nice little hobby space somewhere out in the suburbs, and drop this ridiculous injunction immediately. We all have real work to do. Clara remained perfectly silent. She let his insulting, meager offer hang in the stale, heated air of the room. Her grandfather had always taught her that silence could be a profound weapon if you knew exactly how to aim it. By refusing to engage in their chaotic, emotional manipulation, she watched her family's initial arrogance begin to waver into slight confusion. Sensing the subtle shift in power, Evelyn stepped forward smoothly, placing her leather briefcase on the table. Julian barely glanced in her direction, his lips curling into a dismissive smirk as he took in her presence. And you must be the legal aid representative, he scoffed impatiently. Let's make this quick. Show us where my sister needs to sign to release the property. Evelyn did not flinch at his staggering disrespect. Instead, she smoothly withdrew a thick stack of official documents and slid them precisely into the center of the table. I am not here to facilitate a release, Evelyn corrected, her voice level, warm, yet carrying a terrifyingly quiet authority. I am here to formally serve an emergency stop work order, a notice of fraudulent conveyance, and an injunction completely freezing the developer's escrow accounts pending a criminal investigation. Richard's face tightened, his jaw working nervously, while Martha let out a high, brittle laugh that sounded entirely devoid of humor. "This is absurd," Martha protested, gripping the edge of the table. "We are her parents. We manage the family estate. You cannot simply walk in here and freeze a multi-million-dollar transaction." Julian simply scowled, completely blind to the reality of the trap closing around him. "She's right. You can't freeze the developer's funds," Julian snapped, his voice rising in panic and anger. "My parents are the legal owners of that building. They sold the property to secure my runway. It's a done deal. You're just a cheap lawyer trying to squeeze a settlement out of a successful enterprise." Evelyn folded her hands, resting them lightly on the pristine legal briefs. With the meticulous patience of a predator closing in on its prey, she began to dismantle their entire reality. Her voice remained incredibly calm, contrasting sharply with the rising hysteria across the table. She detailed the specific historic zoning clauses of the Boston neighborhood and the brilliant, loving foresight of Clara's grandfather. She explained the rare concept of split ownership in agonizingly clear terms. The corporate developer had indeed purchased the external brick shell of the building from Richard and Martha. That transaction was valid. However, the interior airspace, the specific structural build-out, the very walls and floors of Unit 3C, belonged solely and irrevocably to Clara. Your parents possessed absolutely no legal authority whatsoever to convey that specific space, Evelyn continued, her piercing gaze locking directly onto Julian's wide eyes. Furthermore, the eviction mandate utilized to clear the property bears a blatantly forged signature authorized by your father. That single action elevates this messy, unfortunate family transaction straight into federal fraud territory. Therefore, the physical asset you proudly use to secure your massive seed funding does not belong to your company. Your collateral is legally and entirely worthless. Clara watched the scene unfold with a quiet, settling peace in her heart. She didn't feel the need to gloat or yell. The undeniable truth was doing all the heavy lifting for her. Julian's arrogant facade completely shattered in an instant when Evelyn slid the original, coffee-stained deed across the mahogany table, stopping right in front of him. Staring down at the century-old ink, the dense legal paragraphs, and his grandfather's undeniable, protective signature, the horrifying truth finally pierced through his lifelong delusion. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that he had sold something he fundamentally didn't own, and his entire startup funding, his grand legacy, was built on a fragile, criminal lie. Julian's face drained of color as his phone began to ring relentlessly. His lead investor was pulling out, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Panic is a uniquely ugly color on people who have spent their entire lives believing they are untouchable. The sheer cruelty Julian had so casually displayed just a few nights ago at the local diner was about to be served right back to him, completely cold and undeniably absolute. The heavy oak doors of the mediation room swung shut with a resounding thud, leaving Clara, Evelyn, and the thoroughly dismantled family standing in the echoey, frigid marble corridor of the courthouse. The polished stone walls and high, vaulted ceiling seemed to magnify the sudden, desperate shift in the family's dynamic. Martha's immaculate, carefully curated posture crumbled entirely. She stepped frantically toward her daughter, her expensive designer handbag slipping ungracefully from her shoulder. Tears that looked remarkably like genuine fear pooled in her eyes as she reached out, attempting to grasp Clara's arm in a gesture of sudden, unearned maternal affection. Richard stood rigidly beside her, the confident color entirely drained from his usually robust face. He invoked the sacred, long-abused mantra of their household, pleading with Clara in a harsh whisper to remember that family must always come first. He begged her to withdraw the injunction, claiming that the forged signature was merely an administrative misunderstanding and that she couldn't possibly send her own flesh and blood to federal prison over a dusty loft. Clara gently but firmly stepped back, refusing to let her mother's desperate, grasping hands connect with her coat. She felt a profound, settling calm wash over her, a quiet strength she had never experienced before. The familiar guilt trips that had successfully manipulated her for over 30 years suddenly held absolutely no power. She looked at her parents not with anger, but with a profound, deeply detached sorrow. Meanwhile, Julian was visibly sweating, his expensive tailored suit suddenly looking far too large for his shrinking, panicked frame. He bypassed his sister entirely, pacing frantically toward Evelyn. His voice was breathless, high-pitched with pure desperation as he begged the formidable attorney for a legal loophole, a temporary exception, a delay, absolutely anything to stop his furious lead investor from permanently pulling his massive seed funding. He aggressively promised exorbitant legal fees, future stock options in his tech company, and endless corporate favors if she would simply draft a retroactive consent form and make the fraud allegations disappear. Evelyn did not flinch, nor did she raise her perfectly modulated, radio-smooth voice. She simply looked at the frantic, arrogant young man with a profound, chilling sense of calculated pity. Slowly adjusting the cuffs of her immaculate navy blazer, Evelyn asked Julian if he happened to remember a freezing, miserable evening just before Thanksgiving, inside the warmly lit confines of the Maple Diner. Julian blinked rapidly, his mind racing, completely thrown off balance by the seemingly irrelevant question. He stammered, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead, unable to comprehend what a local neighborhood restaurant had to do with his rapidly collapsing tech empire and his frozen bank accounts. Evelyn's gaze hardened into absolute steel. She quietly but firmly reminded him of the exhausted, freezing older woman who had stepped inside the diner simply to ask the waitress for a cup of hot water to warm her hands. She reminded him of the loud, cruel disgust he had projected across the crowded room, complaining that vagrants were ruining the property values. She quoted his exact words, reminding him how he had demanded that the worthless woman be kicked back out into the bitter Boston winter. The marble hallway fell incredibly dead silent. Julian's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Martha and Richard stared at the senior partner, a sickening, horrifying realization slowly dawning on their pale faces. Evelyn stepped closer to Julian, her powerful presence commanding the entire corridor. She revealed that she had been that very woman, caught without her wallet, her phone, or her heavy winter coat after a minor car accident on the icy, unplowed roads, freezing and simply needing a moment of basic human grace while she waited for a tow truck. She explained that while he had loudly humiliated her based entirely on her temporary, disheveled appearance, his sister had quietly and anonymously paid for a hot meal, a large black coffee, and a generous cash tip, treating a supposedly worthless stranger with profound, unconditional dignity. "Your sister invested in human decency," Evelyn stated softly, her voice echoing perfectly down the marble hall, delivering the final, devastating blow. "You invested in arrogance. Only one of those yields a return." The family was utterly paralyzed, struck entirely dumb by the heavy, suffocating weight of their own prejudice. Clara didn't say another word to them. She didn't need to. She simply turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing steadily down the long corridor, leaving her parents and brother standing permanently in the wreckage of their own making. An hour later, Clara pulled her modest car up to a dim, quiet temporary storage facility on the industrial edge of town. The air inside her rented unit smelled faintly of cardboard, old dust, and turpentine. She navigated through the maze of wrapped canvases and plastic crates until she found it. Her grandfather's old, paint-splattered wooden stool sat quietly in the corner, a sturdy survivor of the chaos. She ran her fingers over the familiar, deep gouges in the wood, feeling the solid, enduring texture of true love and genuine legacy. The heavy emotional armor she had worn for decades finally cracked, letting the healing light in. Clara sat on her grandfather's wooden stool in the dim storage unit, finally allowing herself to cry, not from loss, but from the overwhelming relief of breaking free. Thanksgiving arrived in Boston with a gentle, redeeming snowfall, blanketing the city's sharp edges in quiet, pure white. The relentless, biting wind of the past few days had finally settled, leaving behind a crisp, peaceful stillness that felt like a deep, collective exhale. The heavy legal dust had also settled over the past 48 hours. The powerful corporate developer, absolutely terrified of being entangled in a highly publicized federal fraud scandal involving a forged deed, had immediately frozen the original transaction. Desperate to salvage their massive luxury condo project without facing endless, expensive litigation, their legal team had approached Clara directly. They negotiated a brand new, ironclad agreement, paying her a substantial premium simply to work their extensive construction safely around her legally protected interior space. Julian's highly touted tech startup was paused indefinitely, his crucial seed funding permanently revoked by investors fleeing the fraudulent collateral. Richard and Martha were left entirely to their own devices, forced to navigate the incredibly messy, humiliating legal fallout they had so arrogantly created. Clara had quietly blocked their numbers on her phone. For the first time in her 31 years, the prolonged silence from her biological family didn't feel like a harsh punishment, it felt like a profound, well-earned peace. The familiar scent of turpentine and old pine returned, no longer carrying the weight of the past, but the promise of a future built entirely on Clara's own terms. Instead of sitting through a tense, miserable holiday dinner at her parents' immaculate suburban dining table, surrounded by toxic guilt trips, passive-aggressive remarks, and endless boasting about corporate milestones, Clara found herself pushing open the heavy glass door of the Maple Diner. The cheerful brass bell jingled merrily above her head, announcing her arrival. Inside, the diner was a haven of golden light and genuine, working-class community. The air was thick and intoxicating, carrying the deeply traditional, mouth-watering aromas of roasted turkey, savory sage stuffing, rich brown gravy, and freshly brewed black coffee. Evelyn was already waiting in a cozy, worn vinyl corner booth. The older woman had traded her intimidating, razor-sharp navy power suit for a beautifully tailored, warm burgundy cashmere sweater and a simple pearl necklace. The formidable lawyer greeted the young artist not as a client, but as a cherished, equal friend, her eyes crinkling with genuine, undisguised warmth. They spent the next 2 hours sharing a massive, traditional Thanksgiving meal, far removed from the cold transactions of the corporate world. The hard-working waitress, who now knew exactly who had anonymously paid for the hot apple pie and left that generous cash tip on that freezing night, kept their heavy ceramic mugs constantly full of fresh, steaming coffee. They laughed openly, sharing quiet stories of their respective youths in the historic city, and celebrated the profound beauty of chosen family. Evelyn spoke softly about her own early days as a struggling law student, facing endless prejudice and closed doors, subtly reminding Clara that resilience was a muscle that only grew stronger when tested. There was absolutely no lingering bitterness or anger in Clara's heart as she listened. She simply felt a deep, radiating gratitude for the remarkable twist of fate that had brought such an unlikely, powerful ally into her life. Evelyn raised her thick coffee mug in a quiet, heartfelt toast, acknowledging the undeniable, life-altering power of unconditional human decency. By mid-afternoon, Clara walked back down the historic, snow-dusted cobblestone street toward her building. The massive steel scaffolding still clung stubbornly to the exterior brickwork, a temporary, ugly inconvenience for the surrounding construction, but the heavy metal door to Unit 3C was hers and hers alone. She pulled the familiar brass key from her coat pocket, turned it in the lock, and stepped inside. The loft was completely silent. The expansive walls were entirely bare, stripped of their vintage exhibition posters, and the ancient plaster bore the ugly, jagged physical scars from the initial, unauthorized demolition attempts. Her hallway was still missing the polished brass mailbox her grandfather had loved so much. Yet, as the crisp late afternoon light poured through the massive, divided-pane industrial windows, it hit the exposed red brick perfectly, illuminating the dancing dust motes in the chilly air. The space was physically scarred, but it was incredibly safe. It was sound. It was completely hers. Clara walked into the very center of the expansive room, her boots echoing softly and steadily against the worn hardwood floor. She carefully unfolded her grandfather's old, paint-splattered wooden stool and set it down firmly on the floorboards. Taking a deep, steadying breath of the turpentine-scented air, she set up her wooden easel. She unpacked a fresh, pristine white canvas, securing it firmly into place. Picking up her favorite, worn-handled brush, she mixed a deep, unapologetic shade of cerulean blue on her wooden palette. With a smooth, decisive motion, she reached forward and made the first bold stroke on the blank canvas, officially reclaiming her sacred sanctuary. She finally understood that the greatest masterpiece her grandfather had left her wasn't the studio itself, but the strength to defend it. Have you ever noticed how the heaviest baggage we carry often isn't our own, but the expectations placed upon us by the people we love the most? Clara's journey reminds us that sometimes, the most courageous thing we can do is to stop shrinking ourselves to fit into someone else's corporate spreadsheet or their narrow definition of success. As the writer reflecting on this story, my heart truly resonates with Clara's quiet, enduring strength. It is a profound reminder that standing up for yourself doesn't always require shouting or causing a scene. Sometimes, the most powerful defense is a simple, unyielding boundary, built on the foundation of your own self-worth. But beyond the family drama and the legal victories, there is a much softer, more vital truth woven into this tale. It shows us that the universe has a beautiful, almost poetic way of balancing the scales. Here is a thought to carry with you. When we strip away the heavy armor of our own judgments, we don't just see people for who they truly are, we invite the everyday miracles they carry to touch our own lives. Julian looked at a shivering woman in a worn coat and saw a nuisance. Clara looked at the exact same woman and simply saw a human being who was cold. That one, silent decision changed the entire trajectory of her life. As we navigate our own busy days, especially as the winter chills set in and the holidays approach, it is so easy to rush past the quiet souls sitting in the corners of our local diners, or walking down our neighborhood streets. Let Clara's simple act of grace be a gentle guide for us all. Perhaps a warm smile, a held door, or a quietly paid tab for a stranger this week could be the very spark that rekindles someone's hope. Remember, kindness is the only investment that never depreciates. If Clara's story of reclaiming her sanctuary and the beautiful, raw justice of Evelyn's return touched your heart today, I would absolutely love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment in your own life where a small act of kindness came back to bless you when you needed it most? Or perhaps a time when you had to draw a hard line with family to protect your own peace? Please, take a moment to share your wisdom and your stories in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and our community thrives on your shared experiences. If you believe in the power of standing tall, the importance of a kind heart, and the raw beauty of karma, please consider subscribing to Retribution Raw. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who might need a little extra strength today, and ring the notification bell so you never miss a tale of justice, healing, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and take care of each other.